Over 2 billion people believe the Bible was corrupted. Think about that. Not slightly changed, not mistranslated, corrupted. Which means one of two things is true. Either God failed to protect his own words, or people are confidently repeating something that isn't true. And that's not a small claim. Because if the Bible is corrupted, then billions of Christians are building their faith on something broken, a book that can't be trusted, a message that didn't survive. But here's the part no one says out loud. If God really spoke, and humans successfully changed his words, what kind of God are we talking about? A God who can create the universe, but can't preserve a book? A God who commands history, but loses control of his own message? Or something else is going on? Because the most popular arguments against the Bible don't come from evidence. They come from repetition, from viral videos, from confident voices, from people who sound certain but never show you the full picture. And once you actually slow this down and examine it carefully, something strange starts to happen. The argument begins to fall apart. Not emotionally, logically. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because there's a moment in the Bible, most people ignore it, where a man touches something sacred and dies instantly. No warning, no delay. And that moment answers this entire debate. We'll come back to it. But first, let's do something almost no one does in this conversation. Let's give the argument its best shot. Let's take the strongest claims people make and see what happens when you actually test them. Because if the text of Bible was corrupted, there should be evidence. Clear evidence. Not theories, not assumptions, not things that sound convincing. Evidence. So let's start with the one you've definitely heard before. The Bible was copied by hand for centuries. Scribes made mistakes. Mistakes piled up. And over time, the message changed. It sounds intelligent. It sounds reasonable. It sounds like something you shouldn't question. It isn't. Because that entire argument depends on one assumption: silence. It assumes the text moved quietly, from person to person, generation to generation, without being publicly read, without being widely quoted, without being checked. But that's not what history shows. What history shows is the exact opposite. From the very beginning, these texts were not hidden. They were everywhere. Read in gatherings, preached in cities, copied across regions, quoted in arguments, out loud, in public, constantly. This was not a whisper. It was a broadcast. And that creates a problem. Because once a message spreads that widely, you can't secretly change it anymore. You would have to change it everywhere, at the same time, across different continents, different languages, different communities, without leaving a single trace of the original behind. Not one. And here's the question no one wants to answer. If the Bible was corrupted, where is the original? Where is the version before it was changed? Show it. Because for a book that was supposedly altered, what we actually have is thousands of manuscripts. Thousands. And when you compare them, they don't drift apart. They converge. They point back to the same message. Not a broken one, a preserved one. And this is where the argument starts to crack. Because the more evidence you look at, the harder it becomes to explain corruption. And the easier it becomes to ask a different question. Not, was it changed? But, how did it survive? And that's where the next argument comes in. The one that fooled millions. The one about emperors, power, and a secret meeting that supposedly decided what goes into the Bible. The Council of Nicaea. You've heard this one. Constantine, 325 AD. A room full of bishops, burning books, choosing others, rewriting history. It's dramatic, it's cinematic, it's perfect for a movie. It just has one problem. It's not history. Because when you actually look at what happened at Nicaea, the entire story changes. The Council of Nicaea was not a secret meeting to decide the Bible. It was a public council called to resolve one specific issue. Who is Jesus? Was he created or eternal? That was the debate. Not which books belong in Scripture. Not rewriting the message. Not editing the gospel. And here's something most people don't realize. By the time Nicaea happened, the books of the New Testament were already being read, copied, and circulated across the Christian world. Decades earlier, in different regions, in different languages, long before Constantine ever stepped into the picture. So ask yourself, how do you rewrite a book that is already everywhere? How do you edit something that has already been copied thousands of times, in different places, by people who don't even know each other? You don't. You can't. Because once something is that widely distributed, it's locked. And this is where the theory starts collapsing under its own weight. Because the more you understand how texts were transmitted, the less believable corruption becomes. But then comes the next argument, and this one sounds even stronger. There are over 400,000 differences in Bible manuscripts. 400,000. That number is designed to shock you, to make you think, this book must be completely unreliable. But here's what that number actually means. Most of those differences are spelling variations, word order changes, minor copy differences, the kind of variation you get when thousands of handwritten copies exist. And here's the part they don't tell you. Those differences are visible, they're documented, they're studied. Nothing is hidden, which means this isn't evidence of corruption. It's evidence of transparency. Because if the text had been secretly altered, you wouldn't see variation. You would see control, uniformity, silence. Instead, what we have is openness. Thousands of manuscripts that allow scholars to compare, verify, and trace the text with incredible precision. And when they do, they don't find a different message. They find consistency across centuries, across regions, across languages. And that, number 400,000. That number is not information. It's intimidation. It sounds big, but it doesn't change the message. Not one central belief of Christianity depends on a disputed word. Not one. So now we've removed two of the biggest arguments. Hand copying didn't corrupt it. Nicaea didn't rewrite it. Variants didn't change it. So the question becomes even sharper. If all of these claims don't hold, why do they feel so convincing? Because they sound right. They spread easily. They survive online. But they don't survive scrutiny. And this is where everything shifts. Because for centuries, critics said something very specific. We don't have the original text. We don't know what it said in the beginning. It changed over time. That argument stood for a long time. Until something happened. Something no one expected. A shepherd throws a rock into a cave and accidentally shatters an argument that had survived for centuries. Inside those caves were ancient scrolls, hidden for nearly 2,000 years, untouched, unedited, waiting. What we now call the Dead Sea Scrolls, manuscripts of the Old Testament, dating back before the time of Christ. This is what critics had been asking for. Ancient copies, close to the source, uncontaminated by centuries of transmission. So when scholars finally opened them, the question was simple. Would they reveal a different Bible, a changed message, a corrupted text, or something else? And the answer was not what many expected. Because when those scrolls were compared, line by line, with the Bible we have today, they didn't tell a different story. They confirmed the same one. Remarkable. Consistency. Across nearly 2,000 years. Not perfect letter-for-letter uniformity, but undeniable preservation of the message. And that's the moment everything should have shifted. Because the argument wasn't theoretical anymore. It was tested, and it held. So now the question becomes harder to ignore. Not, has it changed? But, how has it remained so consistent? And this is where we come back to something deeper. Because at some point, this stops being a discussion about manuscripts and starts becoming a question about God. Because if this book really is what it claims to be, then preservation is not an accident. It's intention. And this is where that moment in the Bible, the one most people ignore, suddenly matters. There was a time when the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object in Israel, was being transported, not carried the way it was commanded, but placed on a cart. And as it moved, the oxen stumbled, the ark shifted, and a man named Uzzah reached out his hand to steady it. It looked like a good intention. It looked like the right thing to do. And in that moment, he died, instantly. No warning, no second chance, just gone. And that moment makes people uncomfortable because it feels extreme. But here's what it actually reveals. He didn't die because God is weak. He died because God does not need protection. And that changes everything. Because the assumption behind corruption is this: that God gave something sacred and then depended on humans to preserve it. That his word survived only if people handled it correctly. But the Bible never presents God that way. Not once. The problem isn't that God can't protect his word. The problem is, people don't like what his word says. And it's easier to say it was changed than to deal with what it actually says. Because if God protects what is holy, not just objects, but his own words, then the idea of corruption becomes something else entirely. Not evidence, but an assumption. And once you see that, another question rises. One that people don't usually ask out loud. What about other scriptures? Because there are places where people are told to go back to those who already had the book, to ask them, to verify, which raises a question. If those scriptures were already corrupted, why point to them at all? Why direct people to something unreliable? You cannot call a book corrupted and still be told to trust it. That is not theology. That is a contradiction. And now we're at a point where the question has changed again, because this is no longer just about history or manuscripts or arguments. It's about trust, because at the end of all this, you're left with something much simpler. If the Bible was corrupted, there should be evidence. Clear, traceable, undeniable. A moment where the message changed. A version that looks different. A line that was rewritten and replaced. But that's not what we find. What we find is consistency. Across centuries, across continents, across languages. What we find is a message that refuses to disappear, that refuses to break, that refuses to be replaced. And that forces a different question. Not, was it corrupted? But, what if it wasn't? Because if it wasn't, then this is not just an old book. This is not just tradition. This is not just something passed down and reshaped over time. This is something preserved, intentionally, carefully, powerfully. And if that's true, then what it says matters. More than we're comfortable admitting. Because the Bible doesn't just make claims about history. It makes claims about you, about who you are, about what's wrong. about what needs to change, about what God has done. And that's where most people step back. Not because the evidence is weak, but because the implication is strong. Because if this is truly God's word, then ignoring it is not neutral. It's a decision. And this is where everything comes to a point. Because at some moment, this stops being a debate about manuscripts and becomes a question you can't avoid. Do you believe God is capable of preserving his own words? Not partially, not approximately, but faithfully. Because if the answer is yes, then the argument collapses. And if the answer is no, then the problem is not the Bible. It's the kind of God you believe in. And now we're back where we started. Over 2 billion people believe the Bible was corrupted. But belief is not evidence. Repetition is not proof. And confidence is not truth. Because when you follow the evidence, when you test the arguments, when you strip away what sounds convincing, you're left with something that hasn't changed. A message that has survived every attempt to question it, every attempt to discredit it, every attempt to replace it. And it's still here, unbroken, unshaken, unchanged. So the real question was never just, was the Bible corrupted? The real question is this: what are you going to do if it wasn't? If this made you question what you've always heard, stay with me, because the next videos go even deeper into the evidence behind the Bible. Subscribe now, and let's uncover the truth together, one story at a time.